fourth webinar. This one is on teaching replacement behaviors. As you can see, I've been told, I've gotten some feedback that it's, for those of you who have never met me, it is a bit odd to listen to my disembodied voice, and so I was asked to actually provide a little visual to go with who you're listening to. That's my official University at Albany photograph that they have on file. So there I am, and you can put a face to a voice. Oh, I think let me see something. Did I get? Yeah, I got two slides out of order, so let's go to the goals first. The goals for today's webinar are to review an applied behavior analytic approach to teaching replacement behaviors. And so we'll be looking at the behavioral pathway, not the entire thing, but we'll be talking about not looking at the entire behavioral pathway being one of the reasons that social skills instruction, the teaching of replacement behaviors, sometimes is less successful than we'd like. And then we'll also be expanding our discussion to look at Bandura's social cognitive theory and how that theory might inform a different approach to teaching replacement behaviors, or an extended approach. So we'll be theoretically grounded in both instances, but as you can see in social cognitive theory, the relationship, behavior, and the environment is indicated just as it is in applied behavior analysis, but in Bandura's model, so-called personal factors, what Skinner might have called private behavior, are also included in the cohesive narrative we create in trying to express our understanding of why individuals behave in the way they do. So in the second part of the discussion, we'll be thinking about the idiosyncratic ways in which the students who we're teaching new behaviors might perceive, think, feel, how their physiology might affect the behavioral choices that they make. So let me go back, and I'll start here. So my perspective, which might be better indicated as my biases, how I think about things. Some of you have heard these before, that I don't view behavior as occurring in a vacuum, but in fact it exists within the context, within a social context, within interpersonal relationships, and that for students with significant behavioral problems, students who need to acquire replacement behaviors, that needed repair and reclaiming work occurs in the context of sustained positive relationships with caring adults. And somewhat ironically, relationship deterioration may even be considered a motivating source of motivation for challenging behavior, in that some students actively seek out the dissolving or fracturing of the relationship with adults because they find that outcome comfortably rewarding, even though it may come at a high price for them. They actually find they have what Bandura might have called an anticipatory or confirmation bias, where they expect things to go south with adults. They may be unconsciously or consciously unaware of how they participate and make that happen, but when it does happen, they find it satisfying because it is their self-fulfilling prophecy coming to fruition. Sustaining positive relationships with somebody who's hell-bent on destroying that relationship requires the grown-up to do a disproportionate amount of the work to sustain that relationship, because the student is actively trying to dissolve it with toxic and noxious behavior, and the adult needs to be able to withstand those invitations to reject and marginalize and hang in there and continue to do the repair and reclaiming work, no matter how toxic and intrusive the student's troubling behavior may be. And that successful repair and reclaiming work requires that we as interventionists construct a cohesive narrative in our mind's eye about the student that is both theoretically sound and guides our interactions, guides our systematic implementation of evidence-based practices. So we don't want to stray from theory, and we don't want to stray from research that has shown that that theory is a sound explication of why humans do what they do. So those are my biases that's where I'm coming from, and that will be readily apparent to you, particularly in the second part, as we talk about a more social cognitive theory approach to teaching replacement behaviors. So we did that. So let's clarify what we mean by replacement behaviors. In a previous webinar, and I'm sure it comes as no surprise to many, if not all of you, that PBIS is indeed a school-wide application of applied behavior analytic principles. It's, if it has its primary theoretical foundation is behaviorism, and that might be construed to be cognitive behavioral theory, and we may even stretch that further as we integrate things like trauma-informed care and restorative justice into the framework. Indeed, some of these interventions may have roots, theoretical roots. It's actually on my to-do list is to educate to myself to what the theoretical foundations of restorative justice are, how we can understand those practices as being theoretically sound. It's a hole in my own knowledge. It's been on my to-do list for a while. But basically, certainly the initial framework coming as it does, Rob Horner, George Sagai, Tim Lewis, they're all, I think, identified primarily with behavioral theory. And so as such, we explicitly teach replacement behaviors across all three tiers of the framework. Whenever a student engages in behavior that's at odds with what our clearly defined behavioral expectations are. So yeah, we teach replacement behaviors. You know, you may be inclined to think of a replacement behavior as an integral part of the BIP that emerges from an FBA, because that's where we use the term most frequently. But the fact of the matter is, whenever we reteach school-wide expectations or classroom expectations to a student who is failing to meet our criteria of acceptable behavior, we're teaching a replacement behavior. Whenever a student is doing X and we want them to do Y instead, we engage in strategies to teach a replacement behavior. Stop doing that, do this instead. This, in that case, is a replacement behavior. We do that at Tier 1 all the time. For any student who doesn't come to us socialized and having an intuitive understanding of what is acceptable and unacceptable at school, we have to teach them directly what to do. And when we do, we're teaching them replacement behaviors. Certainly check-in, check-out, social skills instruction. We've identified that students' behaviors deviating from our clearly defined and taught behavioral expectations. And so the outcome of check-in, check-out is the nurturing, growing, and sustaining of a replacement behavior. And then clearly at Tier 3, when we talk about alternative/replacement behaviors and the success of approximation of many of them on the way to what we call the desired behavior, the student behaving to the extent they are capable in a way that's as close as possible to typical students, the desired behavior. So we see the term used across all three tiers, though typically we use it more explicitly for Tier 3, I think. And across all three tiers, though, when we do that, we're mobilizing theory. We're thinking about the conditions that give rise to behavior. We're talking about whether, we think about prevent, teach, extinguish, and reinforce across all three tiers all the time in service to growing alternative behaviors in students who haven't acquired the behaviors that we think they need to be engaging in. But for our purposes today, we're going to be looking towards the top of the pyramid when we talk about replacement behaviors. And particularly, I would say, my background is in students with emotional behavior disorders, as the previous slide suggested, and I'm going to drift towards that population and thinking about how do we get students to self-regulate sufficiently well to stop engaging in the toxic and noxious, intrusive behaviors that lead to them being rejected by their peers and rejected by their teachers and become increasingly disenfranchised and marginalized over time. so teaching replacement behaviors is intended to, in fact, increase student social competence so that they will achieve greater social acceptance. So we'll talk a little bit, this is an old, back in the 80s and early 90s, there was an enormous amount of federal funding in place to support research into social skills instruction as an intervention that is necessary to alter the trajectory of children with emotional behavior disorders, that the teaching of discrete behaviors would alter the trajectory, the troubling trajectory of kids with EBD. And there was a lot of research in that area. Frank Gresham was one of the key researchers among many others. And you can see there his definition of social competence. So it's about performing a task adequately, and how do we judge what's adequate? Well, it could be the perception of others, parents or teachers. It could be comparison to some explicit criteria. How many times out of how many trials is the student capable of engaging in the appropriate behavior, or in comparison to some reasonably objectively measured normative sample about how typical kids act, is how we sort of go about assessing whether somebody is or is not socially competent. And we talk about social skills as are defined as those behaviors which, within a given situation, predict important and hopefully in a positive way social outcomes. And therefore, social skills, in this case, I'm using the term almost interchangeably with replacement behaviors, therefore are one aspect of the broader construct of social competence. We may be teaching discrete replacement behaviors, but those behaviors are really functional in social interactions with others. And so then there again, I'm making explicit my bias to not thinking of behavior as existing in a vacuum, but instead existing within a social context, and typically within the context of interpersonal relationships with others, peers, and teachers. Any questions thus far? How are we doing, Aaron?
I don't see anyone in the chat. If anyone is trying to type or having a hard time, if you want to ask us if you have a question now. Okay, I think we're all set if you want to continue.
Okay. So, to the extent that a replacement behavior is a social skill, it occurs in a social situation. Historically, the student has engaged in behavior X through some mechanism of assessment. We have determined that the occurrence of X is unacceptable, and the student needs to be retaught to do Y instead. And so learning new behavior is, in fact, an instructional opportunity to reteach social behavior. I'm conceptualizing replacement behaviors as largely synonymous with the teaching of a social skill. It's a skill we want them to use that is new and different than the behavior they had learned to use in that situation based on their previous learning history. We're going to interrupt that previous learning history and teach them a new behavior. And in teaching that new behavior, we're teaching them a new skill, a new social skill. So I'm using the term somewhat interchangeably. And you can see there that teaching social skills has 5 distinct stages. And going through each of those 5 in depth is far beyond the scope that we are able to go into in the 2 hours we have together today. And so I'm not going to even endeavor to do that, though we'll touch on many of those steps. Personally, I find the deconstruction teaching how to teach social skills can be deconstructed across these 5 steps into multiple sub-steps and sub-sub-steps within each of these steps, to the point where, for me, when I teach social skills, I find it mind-numbing. And then you have to do this to make sure that the social skill is learned, and then you have to do this, and then you have to do this, and then you have to do this. And there are some really well deconstructed articulations of that. I find expressing and going through that highly deconstructed multiple sub-steps of teaching social skills somewhat, as I said, mind-numbing. but some of the people whose work that I really like in that area, if you want to look at it more closely, it's just a Google away. I like Tim Lewis's work in that area on social skills instruction, and a colleague of his, Lori Newcomer, I think her name is, has some wonderful PowerPoints that are just a Google away that really break down the sub-steps at each of these steps. I'm going to do it far more quickly, 3 or 4 slides. Then this, again, we're looking at learning replacement behaviors, new social skills, from an applied behavior analytic perspective. This will be language that's very familiar with you when we teach replacement behaviors. We want them to be functionally equivalent, what we call FERBs. We don't want to ask the student to give up their access to the maintaining consequence when they acquire new behavior. We just initially want them to be able to access that sustaining consequence in a less intrusive, more socially acceptable way. Here's where, on these next 2 bullet points, I believe, are where we really fall down in schools, in that, and it's one of the reasons, as we'll see later, why social skills instruction, the direct instruction or explicit instruction in a new discrete behavior, frequently fails to generalize to the criterion environment, because when the child gets back to the criterion environment, the replacement behavior is neither more efficient or more effective in the criterion environment than the troubling behavior. And the efficiency, of course, has to do with how much effort do I have to put in, how hard do I have to work in order to trigger the satisfying sustaining consequence. And the effectiveness of a behavior is how much payoff do I get, how much of the sustaining consequence is allocated to me in response to my effort. And I think in schools we lecture, we appeal to children, we explain to them why it's not in their best interest to continue to use what we judge to be a troubling behavior. We exhort them to stop. We lecture them on why it's not fair or to others or in their own best interest. And maybe even we engage in really good explicit instruction. But if we send a student back to a setting in which the troubling behavior remains more efficient and effective, more powerful than the newly learned behavior, the newly practiced behavior, change is not going to happen. And I honestly believe that, and I think that's one of the challenges we have as behavior change agents, all of us on this call, in that sometimes students target behaviors. They're incredibly efficient because they're highly fluent at it, because they've been doing it for a long time. They do it with what cognitive psychologists might call automaticity. They don't even have to engage working memory to do it. So it comes to them very easily, and they have a history of being satisfyingly rewarded for engaging that behavior. So for us to find something that's easier and more rewarding is our charge. And honestly, I believe many of our behavior change interventions fail because in the moment, the adults who are running the intervention need to be consciously aware of how am I systematically making the troubling behavior less efficient and less effective, and how am I systematically ensuring, prompting, and then rewarding the replacement behavior in a way that is more efficient and effective. If we don't get that right, change doesn't happen. Right, so the reinforcement the student gets has to be more desirable, it has to be more immediate, and it has to occur in greater magnitude, or behavior change doesn't happen. It has to be available more consistently. Replacement behaviors are more socially acceptable, and it's an attempt to make the to not get the child to necessarily give up access to the reinforcement that they find rewarding, but to make their behavior more acceptable and livable to the within the classroom setting. Okay, so we have a couple of stages in doing this, right? And so the first stage is, relationship is incredibly important here. So the first step is to have a discussion with the student in which you, in a very tactful way, point out the gap between their current level of performance and the expected or desired level of performance, right? We all love to get that feedback, right? Here's how you're expected to perform. Here's how you actually are performing. I know that because I'm a fully self-actualized individual, when I get feedback like this, I express my appreciation and make a commitment to improve my performance so that, right, who does that? Who wants to get that feedback, right? People get defensive. People get angry when they're told that there's a gap between how they're currently performing versus how they should be performing. They rationalize their behavior. They externalize responsibility for that gap. It's a very human thing to do. So to get the student to hear you and accept that that gap exists and that they have some responsibility for that gap, you do too as the teacher, because you're going to, right, you're going to stress that this is a skill deficit or a performance deficit, not a character flaw, not a, right? It's just that they haven't learned what they need to learn, and your job is to teach them. But that's relationship building right there. There's trust and respect when you can hear that sort of feedback from somebody, not have that damage the relationship and grow defensive and distant, which in turn will influence how you perceive, think, and feel about ensuing interactions with that person. And then offer to teach the student a new behavior that will allow them to do better. It's an offer to which the student says, yeah, I want to learn it. And there's some discussion in the literature that if you don't get to yes with the student, that if you end up doing the intervention to the student instead of with the student, you're already sunk. That if the student doesn't adopt what is now being called within the implicit bias literature, we'll talk about this a little later, implementation intentions, right? A cognitive preset in your mind's eye to engage in the new behavior under certain circumstances. Implementation intentions, if you don't get to shared implementation intentions to yes with the student, your chances, if you're trying to leverage student behavior change that they're not motivated to participate in, there's some literatures that suggest you shouldn't even bother with the intervention. If the student isn't, if they don't own it and express motivation to participate appropriately. All right, so now we're going to teach the replacement behavior. You guys know this literature well. We've just gone over it's got to be easier, more efficient, the problem behavior, more socially acceptable, same function. We've got to plan in advance as the teacher of the types and sequence of examples and non-examples you'll use to teach the replacement behavior. There's a whole art and science to using examples and non-examples. In the literature, it suggests only the teacher should engage in non-examples so that the student himself or herself doesn't practice non-examples during the teaching, during guided practice. I've seen no research that says that having the student model inappropriate examples of the non-examples of the replacement behavior undermines their learning, and my own personal experience says it's fun for them, and it makes the learning enjoyable, and it helps them discriminate between what is and is not acceptable. But in good instruction, as the instructor, I'm going to think in my head, there's a fine line about what is good enough for me and what I will deem good enough and acceptable and what is not. And I need to make that line first explicitly clear in my own mind so that I can then explicitly teach it to the student. And I do that by using examples and non-examples. And in my first teaching instruction, when I pair an example with a non-example, the discrimination between appropriate behavior and inappropriate behavior is unavoidably obvious because I'm using a highly inappropriate non-example and I'm using a perfect example, and so it's very easy to distinguish. And then as I continue my explicit instruction over time, my examples and my non-examples grow closer and closer, so the discrimination goes finer and finer till I get to that line where just 1 inch this way and it's unacceptable, a little bit that way and it's acceptable. Do we all see what the line is? And of course, when we do this and we teach this, we're sort of talking the talk. Walking the walk then means that I show up after this instruction and I hold accountable the student to that line that I'm going to model them, engage in modeling. I'm going to engage in guided practice where the student gets to do the examples and non-examples. And I'm going to then prepare the student and think in my mind's eye, when is the student going to have opportunities to engage in independent practice with these things in the classroom. And so what we know about social skills instruction is, to the extent that this is a thumbnail sketch of effective social skills instruction, that you can get students to engage in the replacement behavior in the new social skill pretty well, following these instructional procedures. Where we find difficulty is having the student generalize what they learn in these contrived artificial instructional circumstances back to real life, the criterion environment, for a variety of reasons, some of which I've talked about, efficiency and effectiveness. If we don't get that right, the student's not going to generalize back. I'll say more about that in a minute. And so we need to systematically prepare for generalization and maintenance of the replacement behavior. Hope is not a method, right? Bear, Wolf, and Risley all those years ago in 1968 told us to train loosely and not hope and train, or train and hope, rather. And so what does that look like? How do we plan for generalization and maintenance? So we engage in implementation intentions. We have the student identify several in their mind's eye instances and talk about that will arise when the new behavior ought to be used. So we're anticipating its use. We're thinking about them. We're seeing them in our mind's eye. We're reviewing with the student the pre-correction that you, the adult, will provide in the moment as a prevention antecedent intervention to help them remember to make a good choice. So that, and you'll talk about that pre-correction, and you'll explain the use of that pre-correction, and you'll explain that this is your commitment as the teacher to help that student make a good choice. And so in the moment, when that, in the real life moment when that pre-correction comes, it vibrates with that pre-planning that you've done with the student during instruction. The student recognizes the pre-correction for what it's intended to be. And then review, of course, the prompt, right, the and/or correction procedure you use to support the student's use of the new behavior. The pre-correction is, of course, given before the directive to engage in the replacement behavior. The prompt is a response prompt that comes only after error responding has begun, and you want to correct that. So explain to this, hey, if you get off to the wrong step and I see you going down the wrong path, here's what I'm going to say to help you put the brakes on, make a good choice, and make things better, right? And so review with the student. This isn't like secretive voodoo that we do to kids without their understanding of what it is we're doing and why we're doing it, so that the student can be prepared in advance for, well, what is the prompt? And why are you saying it, right? And this is you communicating to the student, I care about you. I'm going to be there in the moment with you. I'm going to recognize your struggle in the moment. I'm going to show up, and I'm going to support you in making good choices. And this is what it's going to look, sound, and feel like, so that you recognize it when it happens in the real world, back in the classroom. Review with the student the positive consequences they'll earn if they respond in a positive way to the pre-corrections and the prompts. Review with the student any aversive consequence. I shouldn't use that word, it's so loaded. Behavior suppressing consequences, behavior weakening consequences, such as extinction or the introduction of the loss of privileges or something, which is a behavior suppression consequence if the student chooses the problem behavior. And again, because aversive consequences is such a loaded term, and because we talk about positive behavioral interventions as support, sometimes we overlook the fact that behavior weakening consequences are in fact evidence-based. Scolding is an aversive consequence. Scolding is a behavior intended to be a behavior weakening consequence, as is timeout, as is response cost, as is overcorrection, as is extinction. So they exist and they're evidence-based, and we can use them. reemphasize the student's commitment to choose the replacement behavior, express your faith in them, your belief. If you've heard me talk about behavioral expectations, you know that I stress the need to base them in social justice values about fairness for all and doing our best work and creating circumstances that allow teachers to do their best teaching and students to do their best learning, because the educational process has such vital implications for the quality of people's lives that it's critical that everybody who's a part of that enterprise behaves in ways that doesn't undermine it. All right, and those are our values, and so tie it back to those values and express your belief in the student that they can be a good citizen in that community who behaves in ways that's consistent with the values and expectations in the classroom. But then as you exit, you got to walk the walk. You've got to stay mindful all day, fully present in the moment, so that you see the student in the moment in time. You arrive at the crossroads where the student could either choose the historically troubling behavior or engage the replacement behavior, and you do, in fact, right at the right moment, provide those pre-corrections and prompts as promised. And that you do, at the moment, self-regulate so that you give the student, in a very particular way, feedback that when they choose to, when they make positive choices based on the pre-corrections you've delivered and the prompts you've provided, they have chosen, by doing that, to earn whatever you've put contingently in place for them on the reinforcement side. You use the same language with the exact same neutral expression when you give them feedback that because they chose to blow off your corrections and prompts and instead engage in the same old troubling behavior instead of the replacement behavior, they have chosen not only not to earn the rewards, but possibly some sort of behavior suppression consequence, behavior weakening consequence. And again, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, those of you who are on the line. The delivery of that feedback to students, either you've chosen via your behavior to earn reinforcement, or you've chosen via your behavior not to earn reinforcement and, in fact, to earn some behavior suppression consequence. To be able to have that exchange with the student in a brief, comfortable, non-reinforcing way is a social skill that we don't provide enough teachers with. And, on my end here at the university, in teacher preparation, I don't think we prepare teachers for those moments. We don't drill them. We don't give them opportunity to learn the scripts that they need to learn, the dialogue that they need to learn, and to recognize the appropriate moments of when to deliver it. So, this description of teaching replacement behaviors I've just described is also a pretty good description for professional development for teachers, because what are the outcomes of professional development for teachers if not changes in their social behavior, right? It's humans acquire and learn behavior, whether you're an adult or a student, a child, and following precisely the same lawful procedures. And so as you can see, even though we're talking about teaching behavior, the more I work from an applied behavior analytic perspective, the more I'm aware that it's dangerous, really, inappropriate to talk about one component of the pathway, in this case, teaching behavior, without also acknowledging that you can't talk about teaching behavior without talking about the manipulations, the environmental manipulations of that we refer to as prevention supports. By altering setting events and modifying antecedents, by eliminating or neutralizing setting events, by infusing the environment with prompts and pre-corrections, triggers for the replacement behavior, and removing the triggers for the troubling behavior, the target behavior. And that if we're going to really talk about students acquiring new behavior, and we're going to engage in that explicit instruction isn't going to generalize if we don't get these prevention and consequence strategies mastered also. Again, that's just another way to say if we don't get the efficiency and effectiveness piece correct as well. So really we need, when we're talking about teaching replacement behaviors, we need to think about all four components of the model. So when we look at individuals learning replacement behaviors, new social skills, what the literature replacement behavior outside of the typical environment is often too contrived, restricted, and decontextualized, results in poor generalization and maintenance of learning, right? The student can do it in the training setting, but not in the applied setting. And thus, research has shown there was a considerable amount of research done. That's what I say, a considerable amount. Sometimes I go to significant amount of research done in the late 80s and early 90s on social skills instruction. It was very popular, lots of funded projects from the Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education, lots of funded scholars doing this work. And again, the hypothesis was that emotional behavior disorders was a result of the failure to acquire discrete social skills. Personally, I don't buy that explanation if that's what EBD is, but I'll say more about that in a moment. Right? And so the failure to generalize and maintain newly taught skills occur because in the criterion environment, it's overpowered by older, more efficient, more effective competing behavior. So those are the reasons why we think we have that weak to moderate overall effect sizes. I have some other ideas that I'm about to share with you in a moment as we make the transition out of an applied behavior analytical approach to teaching new behavior, social skills, replacement behaviors, and think more instead about the social cognitive theory approach. So before we make that transition, I'll stop and see if there's questions. Erin, any thoughts on what I might qualify?
On what? No, so far there's nothing in the chat room. Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
If anyone has, you can ask your questions as you go along too, and I'll just either wait for a break to ask Kevin, or if you don't have any, or if you have a comment about something that he's saying. It's pretty quiet out there.
Stop multitasking, all of you. Stop multitasking. Stop, right? Hang on my every word.
Okay. Looks like we can continue.
All right. That wasn't very good behavior management on my part. All right, so here's the typical, if the behavioral pathway is the explication of applied behavior analysis or behavioral theory about the occurrence of behavior, this is the standard articulation of Bandura's social cognitive theory, sometimes called triadic reciprocality or reciprocal determinism. Fancy graduate school words, right? Reciprocal in this case just means you'll notice that the arrows point both ways in this case, right? In the strictly behavioral model, we start with setting events on the left, and the arrows point towards the right, and we move left to right across the model. In this case, there's an acknowledgement that, and it's true in that model too, I suppose, in that the environment both affects the occurrence of behavior, but the behavior in turn has an effect on the environment. Well, we see that in both models because in the behavioral model we see environmental conditions triggering behavior and environmental conditions rewarding behavior after it happens or not rewarding behavior after it happens. All right, and so, brief definitions of two of the variables, but then Bandura emphasized what he called private variables. And I don't know that he addressed all of these terms because some of them have emerged later in cognitive psychology over time. But from attention selectivity means simply that individuals, out of all the stimuli in the environment, were drawn to attend to some things more than others, and what tends to drive what we choose to attend to versus what we choose not to attend to. Given all the environmental stimuli in front of us, we have to make those choices. Working memory can only engage so many things at a time, 5, 6, or 7, I believe, if I remember, that we make decisions about what to attend to and what not to. And what drives those decisions is our learning history. Cognitive bias is just once we select what we will attend to, we then make sense of what we've observed in a self-servingly subjective way, right? We spin it for ourselves. So that cognitive bias is we understand things in ways that are consistent with what we believed going in. Expectancy bias is just our beliefs about how things will turn out, outcomes. Attribution bias is an interesting one. It's the little story I tell myself in my head about why you're doing what you're doing, how I understand your behavior and what I tell myself about it. Implicit bias, we've heard a lot about recently through with regard to PBIS's interacting with the disproportionality literature, disproportionality in special ed and in school discipline, and the explanation for why folks allocate their behavior differentially with students of color as opposed to white students is this curious phenomenon. I'll talk more about implicit bias. I think implicit bias, given the reality that PBIS is a school-wide application of applied behavior analysis, which is rooted in sound behavioral theory, I think it's interesting that we're citing not only a cognitive phenomenon, but an unconscious cognitive phenomenon to explain differential treatment of different groups of students with regard to discipline. Executive function is just the process, the cognitive process of planning and reflecting on your problem solving. Reflective function comes out of the attachment literature, and it's the ability of the caregiver to create a narrative in their head that accurately reflects what the other is trying to communicate. Self-efficacy beliefs are pretty, what do I believe about myself? What am I capable of? What am I not capable of? And as we'll see, self-efficacy beliefs are pretty powerful drivers of what people choose to do and not do. And then, of course, just basic biological processes are also private variables. So I view this as expanding the behavioral pathway. This is my bias. I will make it explicit for all of you. You can accept it or not. I believe a sound, thorough, fluent understanding of the behavioral pathway is absolutely necessary for success in delivering interventions that help students acquire new behaviors and leave behind old behaviors that we've determined to be unacceptable. I absolutely believe that if you can't look at an environment and understand the environmental conditions that may trigger that behavior, that may occasion a given behavior, and if you can't understand, you don't understand that a given behavior is then made more or less likely by the extent to which it is or is not reinforced, that if you don't understand that process and then can't see it happening in front of you in the real world, you're in trouble, right? So it's absolutely necessary to be fluent in the behavioral pathway if you're in the behavior change business. I believe that. I believe it's absolutely necessary, but not sufficient, because I believe the value added by thinking about these private variables as we think about the little guys in front of us or the not-so-little guys in front of us in middle school and high school, and we create that cohesive narrative in our head that is theoretically sound. I believe our clinical capacity to support change is enhanced when I can include in my cohesive narrative an reasonably accurate understanding of that student's cognitive bias, that student's attention selectivity, what they are hypervigilant to perceive, think, and feel. When I can tell myself, that student tells themselves a little story in their head about why I'm behaving, the way I'm behaving, that is at odds with why I'm behaving, I have a narrative in my head about why I'm doing what I'm doing, but the student tells themselves a completely different story. And usually it's not a very positive story. They see, right, we know that students with behavioral issues perceive adult intervention as adult hostility. And so when I can understand, in this case, right, so I guess I'm using implicit bias somewhat differently than we're accustomed to. I'm asking you to think this. Implicit bias, we hear mostly it's the adults who have it, and it accounts for why they allocate their behavior management interactions differentially with different subgroups of students. In this case, I want you to imagine that your student has implicit bias. And just like teachers are functioning at that very highly fluent a level with such automaticity as to not be even consciously aware of the decisions they're making and the differential allocation of the behavior. The same is true for the student at a moment in time, that many students who engage in toxic and noxious behavior have an implicit bias against adults. It's not against a different race necessarily, right? It's not against an ethnic group, but based on their learning history and their experiences, they allocate their behavior differentially when confronted with adults. I don't need to go through each of these. I just, again, want to reiterate that my bias, my theoretical bias is that the cohesive narratives we create when we think about why a student is doing what they're doing and how we can support them in doing something else instead, i.e. Acquire a replacement behavior or learn a new social skill, that if we can infuse our narrative with the inferences we make about their private variables, those covert processes that happen within the individual, that it enhances our understanding of that student in a way that can be reflected in how we choose to interact with the students, and in a way that might help and support the generalization and maintenance of those behaviors that we explicitly taught following the procedures I just reviewed. As you all well know, I tend to keep saying things until I say it to my own satisfaction. But I was kind of happy with that one because those are some complex kind of, for me anyway, dynamics to understand and to articulate. And so if anybody wants to chime in about your thoughts on that, I'm always looking to clarify my own thinking. Here's a slide that's frequently seen. It's from Walker and Sprague in '99. For a long time within the field of emotional behavior disorders in particular, those youngsters who need to learn replacement behaviors most critically, that for a long time we were very good at documenting the pathway these students followed. We did that two ways. We did that prospectively by tracking them over time to measure what happened to them over time, and we did that retrospectively by finding adults who struggled and then looked back through their history to see what their developmental history had been. So intervening and changing this pathway, on the other hand, comes far more difficult to us. But in more current thinking, this was '99, in more current thinking, we think of this exposure to family, neighborhood, school, and societal risk factors as adverse childhood experiences that create trauma and toxic stress in the students' lives. And for the purposes of my biases about the importance of student-teacher relationships, we see that one of the negative short-term outcomes is actually the dissolution of that teacher-student relationship, and instead being replaced by parent-teacher rejection. So to the extent that many students who are most in need of stopping what they're doing and doing something else instead, learning a new behavior, because what they're doing now is experienced by others as aversive and intrusive, and is getting them marginalized and disenfranchised within their community, their classroom, their school, their neighborhood, that many of those students have in fact experienced trauma in their lives, and we know that empirically. So we know, in fact, that trauma-related toxic stress can affect all of those private variables that Bandura identified for us. And we know that aversive childhood experiences happen in the youngster's environment, but their effects affect both the private variables and the overt behaviors. But then our little workshop, what we can do about that entire reality also exists in the environment. I can't, unscrew a child's brain and physically undo the effects of trauma, via surgery. I can't manipulate the child's mind in some very direct way and get them to perceive, think, and feel differently. My workshop, our workshop, is in the environment, in the kinds of opportunities and experiences we engineer for students so that those things begin to change over time, so that the way they perceive, think, feel, and behave begins to change over time. So instead of having hostile attribution bias or having implicit bias against the grown-ups, or instead of having their executive function shut down under stress, we see them begin to move away from those idiosyncratic predispositions and to build trust and respect and grow the relationship. Just a quick overview of, trauma-informed care certainly is a hot property these days, has been for 5 or 10 years. And we know over time, we also can track over time that the developmental impact of trauma and toxic stress unfolds in a very predictable way. And arrogant individuals that we are, we've accepted as our charge in life. Those of us who have the kinds of positions we all enjoy are saying, see that pyramid right there? For those kids who experience that trauma stress, we're going to make that not happen. See that very predictable sequence from conception to death that affects children across neurological, biological, psychological, and social areas? We're going to, because of what we engineer for those students, because they've had us in their lives, we're going to mitigate and ameliorate that very predictable. Right? So I don't want to read all this. It's a lot of text. But, just that we do know that there's actually, and we don't, what I want to stress here is that when we think strictly on the behavioral pathway, and I think about pre-corrections, I'm not necessarily being mindful in the moment that the student I'm pre-correcting has a brain that's hardwired differently due to the trauma he or she has experienced. I think it is helpful for the adult to be mindful of that in the moment for reasons I hope to make clear in the next few moments. But in fact, there's a physiological change in the brain, particularly around dopamine and why can I never say norepinephrine? And and cortisol levels are all permanently changed by stress. But it's the second part of that second bullet there, in turn leads to increased perception and expression of negative emotions, right? So this trauma, they perceive others as emoting negatively and express negative emotions themselves, both things, and may facilitate unconscious storage of painful child memories, right? And then, so we can read about how the brainstem is dysregulated and the physiology of it is critical and I think can inform. Frankly, I'm not at the point of feeling like I've mastered the physiological aspects of this. I'm more interested in the cognitive and the emotional aspects of this. But these changes in the brain can include altered affective ability, behavioral impulsivity, increased anxiety, increased startle response, in addition to sleep abnormality. So I think it's, as we create those cohesive narratives, to be mindful of the fact that the individual who we're trying to support in acquiring a new behavior is actually their compulsion to continue with the same behaviors they have historically used is supported by their physiological being, right? It's not just the environmental conditions, what's going on with them physiologically. And again, a behaviorist must say, well, I don't deny that, I just don't know what to do about it. I can't observe it and measure it objectively, reliably, validly. And so while indeed it may be a variable that drives students' behavior, I don't know how to measure it, and therefore I have to make inferences about it. And as a scientist, I am loath to make inferences, and therefore anything I can't directly observe and measure, I don't include in my explanation. I understand that. I disagree. I believe making the inference, yes. I mean, how do we measure emotions? We ask people what they feel. Self-report is notoriously spurious. I can't directly right? So the three ways we measure emotion are we ask people what they feel. We can measure their cortisol levels and use cortisol as a proxy for emotion. And the way most people measure emotion, you know what they measure? Behavior, and then infer the emotion. And a behaviorist would say, well, just measure the behavior. Why make the inference? But everything in me tells me that toxic, noxious, troubling, intrusive, challenging behavior has an strong emotional component to it. And I believe it's helpful as the interventionist to think, what emotions is this person experiencing? And I'll hopefully say more about the practical usefulness of thinking about these private variables in the moment with the student, that it's not just hypothetical. There's a clinical application that alters, when we think about intervening with students from a social cognitive theory perspective, that alters the prompt and the pre-correct and the support we provide and makes it different than what we would provide if we operated from a strictly behavioral perspective. The way I think about toxic stress that results from trauma is that of a tuning fork, that the stressful events, the trauma, is metaphorically speaking akin to a tuning fork being rung, and so that a student an individual who has experienced distress in their lives has that tuning fork humming and vibrating in the background at all times. And right, so even when there's no apparent distress or inappropriate behavior, that tuning fork is humming in the background physiologically, cognitively, emotionally. You know, it might be a low vibration, but it's very susceptible. That tuning fork, events in the environment, a student who has been traumatized is not only experiences genuine stress as their tuning fork being struck again, but they perceive neutral events as stressful, that they experience as having that tuning fork being stressed again, and brings that vibration from the background to the foreground and becomes a predominant part of what they're experiencing under stress when they've first been triggered prior to escalating their behavior. So the mental image I use is that tuning fork vibrating continually in the background, and that students who have been traumatized, students who express that trauma in toxic and aversive behavior that we all find challenging and intrusive, are more susceptible to having their tuning fork struck again by events, daily events on a regular basis. And they may be real or perceived stress, act as the strike of their tuning fork and bring that vibration, all of that toxic stress to the foreground on a regular basis. Some of you have seen this before, right? This is, a depiction of our audacity. We know that there's almost a very strong linear relationship between time and the intensity, duration, frequency, and of troubling outcomes. We know that over time, in general, it's not this perfectly straight, but for our purposes, right, that statistically probable outcomes for youngsters who engage in the troubling behavior is pretty stable over time, right? Very, very stable over time. So stable over time that some people would encourage us to think of antisocial behavior in particular as akin to diabetes, in that it is not a condition that will ever cure, but will instead have to manage across a lifespan. Other people don't believe that these problems are intractable so much as our interventions are weak, right? And it isn't that the problems aren't solvable, it's that the interventions we use to solve them are inappropriate. And personally, change it, to something that's more preferred, we need some serious leverage, right, in order to leverage that change in that behavior. And that change in the behavior is the intensive interventions we supply. And again, my own belief is teaching a discrete behavior to a child who's been traumatized and has is undergoing toxic stress and escalates into challenging behavior, that issue extends far beyond the absence of a discrete social skill, a replacement behavior. That there's far more at work than the student hasn't been taught the behavior. And now I'm going to wax anecdotal on you. I had a long history before I came to university life as a direct service practitioner. I was a classroom teacher for kids with EBD in a self-contained classroom. I worked in a nationally recognized model demonstration program for kids with EBD, and I was the principal of that building. And I say only that not to brag, but to indicate that based on those anecdotal experiences, the vast majority of youngsters with whom I worked did not lack the appropriate discrete social skill. They were perfectly capable of interacting appropriately in a variety of capacities, a variety of ways with their peers and with adults, until stress got the better of them. What they lacked was the inhibition, the self-regulatory capacity not to go there, right? Most kids with EBD don't do anything the rest of us don't do. They just do it more intensely, more frequently, and for longer durations, and possibly with a more troubling topography. But it's very few kids who do genuinely unique things that the rest of us don't do. Everybody gets angry. Everybody has engaged in some regrettable form of aggression. Now, you might say to me, hey, Kevin, don't go making assumptions about me. Don't you project your own neuroses onto me, right? But my own experience is that, most humans walk a fairly crooked path. So I think it's helpful to think that these students are just experiencing more intensely things we all experience. And again, my bias is if we're going to leverage truly intensive interventions, we're going to need to go far beyond merely teaching replacement behaviors in the way we discussed in the first half hour of this webinar. Again, I think that's absolutely necessary to engage in that explicit instruction to get the contingencies of reinforcement correct for desirable behavior, to get prevent, teach, reinforce, and extinguish right, and to bring those things to fruition in genuine ways within the teaching environment is critical. I'm not diminishing it. I just don't think it's sufficiently intensive. I think we need to take on these private variables to leverage long-term change. And my own bias is the reason that social skills instruction doesn't generalize well is because we provide it without any direct addressing of the private variables that are at work. My own bias is that physiological, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral components of what people do act in complementary fashion to one another, and that if we're going to leverage change, we better understand the idiosyncratic ways the individual perceives the environment. We better understand the idiosyncratic emotional profiles that an individual has. We better understand the idiosyncratic ways, the well-worn stories, the cognitive patterns the person has if we're going to leverage change, if we're going to form a relationship with that person. So what do we know about that toxic stress? What we know is at the top, right, there's your tuning fork humming up there, right? And so when the tuning fork's not humming and people are relaxed and not under stress, that blue part of the brain in the front, known as our prefrontal cortex, is where executive function and self-regulation live. As you can see, emotional regulation there and inhibitory processes, top-down guidance of attention and thought, reality testing, all exist in that prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is superior to the amygdala and the hypothalamus and the stratum, and modulates the impulses that are coming out of those aspects of the brain. But under stress, in preparation for fight, flight, and freeze, the frontal cortex shuts down, and those processes stop. And emotional responses and compulsive behaviors that the parts of the brain responsible for that take over. And so right when you need self-regulation most, it's least available to you. And if any of you have ever experienced, and again, you can say, Kevin, don't project onto us your own shortcomings, but if any of you have ever experienced being present enough in the moment when you were emotionally aroused, when your thoughts were racing, and there was a little part of you was telling yourself, don't say it, don't do it, don't say it, don't do it. And another part of yourself was saying, oh, say it, do it. It's going to feel really good when you do, right? That was, that say it and do it piece. And then, in fact, if you did say it and do it, and it felt very satisfying in the moment to say it and do it, even if you knew it was unacceptable, unhelpful, hurtful, that was, your prefrontal cortex losing out to the impulses in the deeper recesses of your brain. And it was your cognition and your affect, what was happening with those things, wanting to have a satisfactorily complementary relationship with your behavior, right? Some people, I've heard stress described as resisting the impulse to, I shouldn't go there, this is so inappropriate, choke the living you-know-what out of somebody who really deserves it, right? That it's stressful when you put a block between what you're thinking and feeling and how you behave. That is a draining experience to self-regulate through that moment and experiencing those thoughts and those feelings and not engaging in complementary behavior. And, of course, we lack the tools to self-regulate in those processes. And this is one of the reasons, as we'll talk about later, we need implementation intentions for those moments because we need to keep the prefrontal cortex firing. And one of the things we'll talk about is when the student's prefrontal cortex goes from blue to gray, as the adult in that situation, as that child is being triggered and growing agitated and becoming more emotionally aroused and cognitively irrational and potentially behaviorally intense, right? The Holy Trinity: emotionally aroused, cognitively irrational, behaviorally intense. That we need to think about those private variables at that moment and realize that that the student's prefrontal cortex and executive function has shut down, and that at that moment in time, we need to take that on that role for them. We need to take those covert processes and model them out loud for the student in the moment because the student doesn't have the capacity to do it anymore. It is at this moment that implicit bias takes over, right? This deep, unconscious tendency to allocate our behavior differentially, often along some sort of tribal lines. In this case, students feeling like the competing, threatening tribe isn't a different race, it's grown-ups. Any questions?
I don't see anything in the chat box, but if anyone thinks of anything, please enter it in the chat, and I will let Kevin know. Or comments.
So adding this, as I've listened to presentations on implicit bias, and of course Kent McIntosh is one of my favorite people to listen to. He's so articulate and engaging on the topic. I couldn't help but think, we talk about implicit bias as being at the root of why adults engage in regrettable behavior, that there's this unconscious, I guess the right word is motivation to allocate your behavior differentially. How implicit bias works is never really explained, just that it is the root cause of why we do it. I've never heard a satisfactory explanation of. I guess I think it's interesting that in an applied behavior analytical approach, such as PBIS, we account for why people do what they do by saying individuals engage in a given behavior under given environmental conditions in order to access a specific type of environmental response that serves a function. But yet we don't apply that same logic, that same theoretical logic to the explanation of teachers, of adults, school personnel's differential allocation of their behavior. We don't say, when presented with a heterogeneous group of students, teachers engage in differential disciplinary actions that are disproportionately harsh for students of color because they find it reinforcing to do so. Suddenly we take the explanation for that behavior off of the behavioral pathway and we put it on, and we this unconscious phenomenon. And I understand one of the reasons to do it is to make discussion of differential allocation of discipline behavior less threatening to the listener in terms of thinking as if you're being accused of being racist. And so this gives us a pass like, oh, it's not my fault. It's this thing we're hardwired for deep in the recesses of our brain to favor those individuals who are members of our tribe and to be cautious and quick to defend against others who are different than us. I get that, but I still don't understand. I've never really heard a convincing articulation of how implicit bias works, just that it causes us to do this. But anyway, so when we think about implicit bias, it isn't just that the implicit bias leads to the troubling response. It's mediated by a certain situation, what's referred to in the implicit bias literature, the disproportionality literature, as a vulnerable decision point. And so what constitutes a vulnerable decision point is being under stress. The elements of the situation itself that you might perceive to be threatening or frustrating or disappointing, right? So it's the situation itself, but it's also the internal state of the individual, things such as fatigue, frustration, anger, the ambiguous behavior of the other. So again, in this case, if we go to disproportionality training, we're taught to think about this going on inside ourselves, the adults in the room. I'm encouraging you to take the same phenomenon, this idea of implicit bias, and say, this is what's going on with the kid once they get triggered. Once they begin to get agitated and start the escalation to highly troubling behavior, that their implicit bias is taking over, that elements of the situation that they perceive in a very idiosyncratically self-serving way. Remember, these youngsters have hostile attribution bias. They have expectancy bias. They expect things to go south with adults, that they perceive adult interaction as intervention as adult hostility, that they're predisposed to perceive our neutral, even nurturing behavior as hostility, and that so instead of thinking about the situation and the decision state with regard to the adult managing whatever deep-seated impulse they may have to allocate differential discipline, I'm asking you to think this is what's going on for the kid too. Deep within their recesses, these private variables that are at work, acting in what we might consider the other term for setting events, operationalizing conditions, right? That make it more likely the individual will engage in the troubling behavior. So what's going on at that moment, right? your executive function is narrowing and beginning to shut down, right? So what happens to perception and cognition at that moment when your tuning fork is starting to vibrate, your prefrontal cortex is beginning to shut down in deference to other aspects of your brain, the amygdala, and so on. What's happening cognitively in the mind at that moment? So if we can review these steps quickly, right? So if we can think of reality, for lack of a better term, as reasonably objective depiction of events, as a videotape recorder might capture it. But of course, people even look at videotapes differently, right? If you can think of how subjective perception is, I'm not going to remember his name, but somebody on the call will. I should. The gentleman on Staten Island, I believe, who was selling loose cigarettes on the street and was confronted by a bevy of police officers who, and their exchange escalated into a confrontation, and he was physically restrained by a number of officers, and he died during that restraint from I think some level of asphyxiation due to asthma and respiratory problems, plus the intensity of the restraint. And some people look at that videotape and see a person who is getting precisely what he ought to have gotten from the police, given the choices he made. Other people look at that videotape and see a victim of police brutality. It's the exact same events, but people perceive, experience, and understand it completely differently. Well, that difference is what's going on between you as the interventionist for the child in front of you and the child. You are perceiving events in uniquely different ways. How does that happen? Each of you are selecting data from what there is to be, right? And the selection of that data picking that data is selective. You focus on some things and not others. Each of you do. Each of you adds meaning. You spin it, right? You subjectively understand what it is that you've just now perceived and attended to. You make assumptions about the other and where they're coming from and why they're doing what they're doing. Another good example, by the way, is Jeff Sessions' recent use of the phrase, what did he call it? The Anglo, anybody remember the exact phrase? The historically Anglo roots of the justice system in this country. Anglo-American, maybe?
I think Anglo-American.
Yeah, roots of the justice system in this country. And some people heard that as a dog whistle for racism. Other people heard that as, so if you're inclined to perceive Jeff Sessions one way, you heard it as a dog whistle for racism. If you didn't perceive Jeff Sessions, you saw it as a perfectly acceptable use of a phrase that's widely used in discussions of jurisprudence in this country. Completely separate realities by different constituencies. Well, in this case, you've got two constituencies, the adult and the child, right? You each are selectively attending. You each are subjectively understanding that which you attended to. You each are making subjective assumptions about the other's motivations. Based on that, you draw conclusions and adopt beliefs and then engage in interactions, which in turn influence, right? It becomes a recursive circle. Your actions in turn influence the environmental conditions, the reactions around us. So I'm actually engaging in a way that, right, so in this case, the child is prompting the adult to engage him by selecting a behavior that's provocative. And when the adult does in fact engage him, the child says, see, I told you the adult was hostile. They don't say to themselves, see how I provoked that adult? See how I made that come to fruition by the choices I made? They simply say, my beliefs, the conclusions I draw, are confirmed by what I just provoked the teacher to do. All of these issues, the selecting of data, the subjective understanding, the assumptions I make about the attributions that drive your behavior, the conclusions I draw, all of these are influenced by my expectancy and my implicit biases, right? This is a story I'm telling myself in a very fast and very fluent way, a narrative that I'm creating that I may or may not be able to consciously articulate. But I'm being very purposeful in trying to draw from the environment a reaction that's consistent with my expectancy and my implicit biases. What do we know about anger? There we were talking about perception and cognition. Let's talk about emotions. Angry people perceive ambiguous intentions as hostile intentions. Angry people rationalize being indiscriminately punitive. Indiscriminately optimistic. Angry people are indiscriminately optimistic about their own chances of success. So that indiscriminate punitive response you just issued to that student who misbehaved, you're unrealistically optimistic that it's going to work. Angry people are careless in thought. Angry people are eager to take action. That's not like a recipe for conflict, right? And if we think that oftentimes in the exchange in a classroom, it's not just the child who's experiencing anger, but if in fact children in stress are able to create in others their feelings of stress, their adults frequently has to manage their own emotional response in the moment as well. What Nick Long used to call the double bind. Not only do I have to manage the child, I have to manage myself. These bullets, these are fairly new for me when I went out and did the work on. So what do we know about the relationship between anger and cognition? How does anger interact with how people think? Makes a whole lot of sense to me that these are some identifiable. These are the stuff of VDPs, right, of vulnerable decision points. I'm angry. I'm having these emotions and I'm having these thoughts. This is what we label in our discussion of implicit bias and intervening to ameliorate our tendencies towards implicit bias. The self-regulation in which we have to engage in during VDP. Well, this is what's going on for us during a VDP. And it's also what's going on for the child, right? The child is experiencing a vulnerable decision point at this point, and are they going to behave in a way that reflects their implicit bias and their expectancy bias? Are they going to want to escape cognitive dissonance by making the same old happen again, right? Or are they going to make a choice to engage in a new behavior? Right, so I use the term self-fulfilling prophecy, sometimes called the Pygmalion or Gollum effect. What do I mean by that? Right, so the things that we believe, the mental models we've constructed in our head influence how we choose to act towards others, which in fact impact their beliefs about us and their actions towards us, which then reinforces our beliefs. So we have this self-fulfilling prophecy where students engage in provocative toxic behavior that incites adults to react to them. Their self-fulfilling prophecy is adults are hostile. They don't care about me. They'll quit on me. Their expectancy bias is I will be mistreated. I will be treated unfairly. I will be rejected. And then they choose behaviors, given that that's their behaviors, that's their beliefs. They choose behaviors that are an articulation of those beliefs, which in fact then impacts others' beliefs about them and actions towards them. And then when that adult comes and reacts towards that provocative toxic behavior, the student simply says, see, I told you, right? The adult may say something as simple as, when you choose not to follow my directions, walk around the classroom without permission and knock materials off your desk, you're choosing not to earn all your behavior contract points. The adult perceives himself as giving objective, unemotional feedback to the student for the quality of their performance. But because reality is perceived subjectively, the student experiences that feedback from the adult as adult hostility, right? So, right, and having your self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, let's see. I think I have that actually. So, contend that bringing self-fulfilling prophecies to fruition is highly reinforcing. When your expectancy biases are borne out and you're able to say to yourself, things in the world are exactly as I believed them to be and understood them to be, there's an enormously reinforcing aspect to having your world continue to be consistent and make sense, even when that consistent reality, that comfortable shoe that you want to wear, comes at a high price, such as social rejection, academic failure. Being able to tell yourself, having the comforting familiarity of my previous experiences informing my new experiences. And when we don't have that, when instead the world coughs up a different set of experiences that instead throws us into cognitive dissonance. Oh my God, maybe, this person is actually being decent to me. This person is being fair. This person is being caring. That's inconsistent with my beliefs about myself, the world, and my place in it. How can that be? I need to create a circumstance that drives that person to act in a way that at least allows me to perceive them in a way that's consistent with my expectancy bias. So I think I've addressed that. So if we come back to the behavior pathway, is one way, as I said, to organize our cohesive narrative of why that B minus, that inappropriate behavior, that target behavior there on the pathway is occurring. And we simply say that B minus, that target behavior, well-defined, operationally defined in a way that can be validly and reliably observed and measured, quantified in some way, occurs under very explicit environmental conditions in order to prompt a specific set of environmental responses that serve as sustaining consequences in a functional way, right? So this individual does these behaviors under these conditions to get this reaction that serves that function. That's one cohesive narrative. This individual engages in these behaviors under these conditions to get this reaction that serves that function. But Bandura and others have told us other private variables matter too. These are what those private variables are, and I would argue that these private variables affect the way the person perceives the environment. So here's my bias at work again. You can scrub an environment. For a child who's been traumatized and has been victimized by toxic stress that may be ongoing or easily triggered on a daily basis, even if their life today isn't continually toxic. If they've been through the ringer historically and their tuning fork continues to vibrate on a daily basis in the background, that you can scrub the environment of all the reasonable environmental features that might reasonably be conceived to be a trigger for troubling behavior. But if a child comes into your room with their tuning fork vibrating, if they come in and they're experiencing, their thoughts are spinning and they're emotionally aroused, they will find a trigger, right? Because perception is subjective, right? And you can simply make eye contact with a student in a neutral way, and a student will perceive you as giving them the stink eye or being hostile, right? They will experiencing something in the environment that makes expression of their pain, their indignance, their anger legitimate. I don't care how carefully you scrub the environment of functionally related antecedents and setting events that you've identified through your FBA. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think you shouldn't scrub the environment for that reason. I think we should, because the more difficult we make it for the student to perceive the environment as hostile and therefore their behavior as justified, the easier it is to counter that perception when we do the work with the student about what happened. So if, in fact, I do roll my eyes and I do get a little exasperated tone in my voice and I do give the student the talk to the hand sign, I'm inviting the student to perceive me as hostile. If I do do, in fact, give the student work that's too hard for them and don't differentiate instruction so that they can. These all make it very easy and, in fact, understandable for the student to perceive the environment as a hostile setting in which they are entitled to defend themselves with what we call toxic behavior. They have no motivation to change. They're entitled to what they did because we created conditions that were threatening to them. If we're going to counter that perception, it is far easier to counter those perceptions if none of those elements exist in the environment. If we do plan for academic success, that takes a threat out of the environment. If I don't roll my eyes, if I don't suck my teeth and get tone of voice, if I don't ignore the student because I've had it with them, right? If we take all of those things that might make it more legitimate for the student to perceive us and the environment a certain way, then they're a distortion to make the environment seem threatening, and therefore their behavior justified, becomes increasingly sort of over the top. There is no, right, and therefore easier to challenge when you, wait a minute, let's talk about what was going on, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But, right, so I'm not saying don't do it. I'm not saying don't talk to a student and say, when you choose not to follow my directions, you're choosing not to earn all your points. But do be mindful of the fact that you said that in a very neutral, contingent way that's perfectly consistent with behavioral theory. But when we add social cognitive theory, you also understand and realize that the student might be hearing it as, you stole my points, you bastard, right? Two very different things, just like the Jeff Sessions quote, two very different, was it a dog whistle, wasn't it a dog whistle, right? Was my feedback to the student that they didn't understand their points natural consequences delivered in a neutral way that's consistent with exactly what we agreed to, completely devoid of hostility, or in fact, was it me being hostile? And my bias is that it is very helpful for me to be mindful of the self-serving perceptual distortions based in expectancy bias and implicit bias and attentional selectivity, and there's how things happen, and then there's how people perceive things happen, and that it is clinically advantageous for me to be mindful of the self-serving ways children perceive, think, and feel, in addition to understanding the relationship between their behavior and the environmental conditions that precede and follow it. This slide some of you have seen me use before. This is the Colorado River carving its way through the Grand Canyon, and I use it as a metaphor for the river being the predictability of the student's troubling behavior over time, and that as interventionists, it's our job to help the student carve a new path in the side of those canyon walls, maybe about halfway down the left-hand side. It looks like we have a little opening that we might encourage the student to go through, right, to stand at that moment in time and help, if you look halfway up the left side to where it looks like there's a break in the canyon wall, we might think of that as the decision point where the child can either choose to engage in B+ or B-, engage in the troubling behavior or the replacement behavior. When you stand there, I believe it's very helpful in ways I will demonstrate in a moment to be mindful of the student's private variables and not just the relationship of the student's behavior to the environmental conditions that both precede and follow it. So we're pretty audacious, right? We're going to, the other image I get in my head is of, being in a jungle and stepping off of the well-worn path and taking a machete and hacking a new pathway as a metaphor for behavior change. So some of you have seen this one too, but if when a student is beginning to experience the physiological, perceptual, cognitive, and emotional effects of stress and is making the transition from consciously self-regulated behavior to choices rooted in implicit bias and is on the brink of relationship-damning behavior escalation, as interventionists, we're going to have to serve as a proxy for the student's lack of frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex activity and related executive function shutdown in order to model self-regulatory self-talk that yields self-control for the student. We are going to be the executive function for the students. We will provide the missing prefrontal cortex activity. All right, but when you do that, you got to wear the big suit. And I'm dating myself here, but this is probably from, I don't know when we stopped making sense. This is probably from the 1980s. It's David Byrne of Talking Heads. He explained his use of the big suit in this conference by saying, he took it from Kabuki theater, and the idea was that things in Kabuki theater, Japanese Kabuki theater, are exaggerated so people far back in the audience can still experience them, so they have to be larger, and right? And so he took on that. This was Byrne integrating a Kabuki element into his concert presentation. But because I'm a nerd when it comes to, teacher-student relationships, I think of the big suit as what a teacher has to have on when they stand at that crossroads. When you stand at that place in the river where maybe you can go left through the canyon wall there, the teacher's standing there at that moment in time and is going to provide the scaffolded supports in terms of the pre-corrects and the prompts. But more than that, as I'll show you in a minute, to help the student that at that moment in time, having the big suit on means you're going to be fully present for the student. You're going to remain, despite the fact that they are getting emotionally flooded, cognitively irrational, and behaviorally intense, the fact that you are a dimensional, consistently caring person who has put in the work with them can shine through in that moment, and they will see your scaffolded support and allow you to help them make a better choice, despite all the momentum that the Colorado River has to continue along the same path. You are going to take that river and say, hey, let's flow this way through this little gap in the wall that I've been working on chiseling for you, right? And so the way we do that is with implicit bias. When we're talking about adults, one of the primarily most successful interventions to help adults counter their implicit bias, and to the extent that they interact with different subgroups of students differentially, particularly around discipline, is we engage in implementation intentions as a strategy for more successfully managing what we call vulnerable decision points. So at that vulnerable decision point is what I'm conceptualizing as the student being not just the environmental conditions, but we're also thinking about the idiosyncratic cognitive, what we're calling cognitively irrational, emotionally aroused, flooded, and behaviorally intense aspects of that vulnerable decision point, right? That there's an emotional component and a cognitive component and a physiological component to that vulnerable decision point. In this case, for the student. Again, mostly when we hear this, we're talking about the adult managing that vulnerable decision point so as not to allocate their behavior differentially for different subgroups when disciplining students. I'm using it here from the student's perspective. The student is at a vulnerable decision point, that point where the Colorado River can continue straight or go left. What's going on for them? And so at that moment, what we know, what's an effective intervention for adults, there's considerable research on that, is this idea of implementation intentions, the idea of establishing in our mind's eye when I will act, where I will act, how I will act, and committing to these thoughts. When will I engage in the behavior? Where will I engage? Are like the flicker of light that's going to stay on in the prefrontal cortex that wants to shut off during the vulnerable decision point. These are the commitments to say, hey, have a few neurons still firing that remembers that I committed to act a certain way at a certain time, in a certain place, and in a certain way. All right? That those neurons will still fire, and my prefrontal cortex won't shut down, my executive function won't shut off entirely, and I will have redoubled my commitment to having those neurons continue to fire so that I can manage that moment in time differently. Right, so here's a slide that's been around. Again, Walker, Colvin, and Ramsey have identified your typical escalation if you've ever been crisis intervention trained or skip trained or any of those things. You've seen a slide like this, right? And the individual's calm, they get triggered, it goes up to peak, de-escalation. But right, so this is where relationship gets damaged because the student's doing particularly outrageous, toxic, and noxious things. And this is where when individuals lack the self-control or are audacious enough to be this intensely, to deviate this intensely from normative behavior, to do things that are really distinguished in extreme ways from what's expected of typical youngsters, relationships get damaged. And it's at that point that people begin to wonder, is the student appropriate for this setting? Arguably, placing a child in a more restrictive setting can be, you can argue this both ways, and I know you non-district folks can argue it both ways, is the failure of the relationship of the first environment. The people in the first environment are saying, this student has such intensive needs that his presence here is no longer acceptable. And in fact, for many kids, we may be telling ourselves, so we're going to send this person to the place where their nurturance, where they can get the nurturance they need, the support they need. But that child experiences that, see, they quit on me, right? So, and it's those peak experiences. It's these peak experiences that get foster parents to say, this kid can no longer live with me. It's these peak experiences that get teachers to say, this child is no longer appropriate for my classroom. It's this peak experiences that get families to say, help, right? We can't even live with our own child anymore. Relationships get damaged during those peak experiences. And what we know is that there needs to be the opportunity to repair and reclaim that work. And for me, in my background, the training to do that repair and reclaiming work was me being trained to do life-space crisis intervention. But, you know, for our purposes today, I'll simply say, to the extent that we can help students become aware of their own private realities, the extent that we can help students by processing after recovery, what happened to you? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? How did those thoughts and feelings come out in behavior? Did that make things better or worse for you? Are you interested in doing it differently next time? But the extent to we can make those covert processes, the thoughts, the feelings, the predispositions, known to the student, him or herself. So instead of insidiously being unconscious motivations, we can bring them out into the open and say, look, you're having those thoughts, you're having those feelings. We've talked about this. When you have these thoughts and feelings, they often come out in these behaviors. We've talked about not doing that anymore. Metaphorically, we've talked about not having the Colorado River not continue on its traditional path, but instead taking that left-hand turn through the canyon wall. Here's the opportunity, right? And so the prevention work that I just talked about, when the student first gets triggered, to help them so that they don't go to peak, is made robust by the work you do after the first escalation and the second escalation and the third escalation. I'm going to wax a little kumbaya on you, and I'm going to ask you to think about your own relationships and the extent to which you've had conflict in your own relationships, people you really care about, with whom when you were emotionally aroused and when your thoughts were running away from you, you perhaps engaged in regrettable behavior that you wish you hadn't moments later. And if you're committed to that relationship, afterward, you talk with that person. You processed what happened. You shared with them what you were thinking and how things made you feel. And they do too. And there's a meeting of the minds about, it's an opportunity to grow a shared perception of reality that happens with that processing, right? if we just get that kid calm and send them back to the classroom, then he logs that experiences in his own idiosyncratic way. And he may go back to the classroom feeling justified that he engaged in the behavior because you'd put him in a threatening position. You'd been hostile to him, right? That perception needs to be challenged. Those feelings need to be identified so that they can come under conscious self-regulation. Those thoughts, if anybody's trained in it's been so long since I thought about it, but rational emotive therapy, I think it's called, where irrational thoughts are challenged and replaced with more rational thinking, right? That work happens afterwards, and that takes time, and somebody is demonstrating, yep, you were just toxic as hell and really difficult. And look at, here I am, still caring and saying, when somebody I care about gets that upset, I want to understand what happens so that we can work hard to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that work, and I'm hothousing it here, we can't possibly do it in 2 hours, the discussion of what happened, the making overt of the covert private variables through that discussion, then makes this part here that much, because all of that work then informs that moment of time. That star is where you show up in the big suit. This over here is where you put the big suit on. This is where you are wearing the big suit so the student can still find you and follow through on their implementation intentions in the moment, right? But they're going to need your support. So when you show up in that moment to provide that support, it's not just a pre-correction and it's not just a prompt. The pre-correction and the prompt have infused in it an understanding of the private variables that Bandura identified at work in this process. So the first thing I might do to a student when I go over is decode or identify the emotion or thoughts they're experiencing. I can see you're really frustrated and angry. I can see you're really upset. I can see you're really disappointed. Whatever we think the emotion is. Many, many children, particularly some would say male children, right? If I were to ask you which of the two sexes is more emotionally intelligent, I think the stereotypical answer would be women are more emotionally, more in touch with their feelings, more expressive of their feelings, more able to communicate about their feelings. So if we think about a little 10-year-old angry boy, and we ask him, how are you feeling? The answer you're going to get is, I don't know, good, bad, right? They're not like, it's the rare 10-year-old who's going to say, I'm stricken with ennui. I'm ambivalent, Mr. Quinn, right? I mean, you're not going to get that. The students' emotions don't occur necessarily within students' conscious purview, and they don't have the language to label them and take ownership of them. So the first thing we're going to do is label the emotion that the students, right, the private reality for them and the thoughts that they may, right? So we might say to them, I can see that you're feeling really disappointed and that you're thinking it's a jip that a person you were really looking forward coming to today didn't show up, right? So you take those overt processes of emotions and thoughts, covert processes of emotions and thoughts, and make them overt, put them right out there in the world where we can see them, so that now they're under our conscious purview to self-regulate. And then tell the kid he has every right to think and feel that way, given what he's experiencing, right? Now, you know, if in fact, in our stereotypes, women, females, are more, I don't even need to go there. I will just ask you to contemplate how it feels when somebody says, when you go to somebody and say, this is how I've reacted to this thing, this is how it made you feel, and the person is dismissive of your emotional reaction as unnecessary and uncalled for. Does that calm you right down? When somebody rolls their eyes because you're upset, like you're overreacting, that's unnecessary, get over it. Do you say to them, thanks for pointing that out to me, that you're 100% correct, I'll never have that, right? Or do you want to have your emotions sanctioned and justified and approved of, right? You want to put you put out a fire with gasoline, tell somebody that they don't have, right? And then the next thing we do is remind the student that even when they're emotionally upset and cognitively has their head spinning, they still have to make a good behavioral choice. One of the things research tells us about children is that they don't, and youth, is that oftentimes their private behavior and their public behavior is the same thing. So anger and aggression are one thing. So when you tell the student he can't throw the desk over, he hears you can't be angry. And again, we just talked about, does it calm you down when somebody indicates to you you're not entitled to have the emotional reaction you're having? And I think we can all admit it is an escalating event to have somebody, right? So the adult thinks to be dismissive of your emotions. So the adult is thinking, I'm just giving the student feedback that it's against destruction of property, is against our classroom values and rules. And the student is hearing, you're telling me I'm unentitled to my indignance. I'm not allowed to have these thoughts and feelings. And it is an accelerating experience, not a decelerating experience for the student. So we have to distinguish between the feelings and thoughts, which we tell them they are entitled to have, and the behaviors which they are not entitled to engage, and instead we're expecting them to use the replacement behavior that we worked on during the repair and reclaim. And, oh, by the way, during that repair and reclaim stage, that involves the explicit instruction in the replacement behavior that we covered in the first half hour, teaching the student a new behavior. But we're teaching the student to use the new behavior not just under certain environmental conditions, but also under certain private variable conditions. Right? Appeal to the student's controls and goals. You can do, I believe in you. You're working on this. You have a choice. You can do the same old mess, and engage in those behaviors that we agreed make things worse for you instead of behavior. Or you can use the help we're providing you and instead ask for time away. Right? If the replacement behavior is a break card or a request for time away. And then affirm your belief in the student. We don't have time for it, but this is as close to a magic wand as I can give anybody who's working with troubled kids with regard to showing up at that prevention stage where the star is. That's where these things get said. That's where you're showing up in the moment with the big suit. That calm to trigger to agitation is the stage at which it's going to be determined whether the Colorado River runs down the path it's always run, or whether due to the trust and respect and the relationship that you've built with the child because of the repair and reclaiming work you've done at the back end, they will accept your support at that moment and choose the alternate behavior. Choose to take the left-hand turn and go through the canyon wall. This decode, sanction, prompt, appeal, affirm strategy, once you get good at it, by the way, you can deliver it in like 40 seconds. It's not, of course, a behaviorist would say decode, sanction, prompt, appeal, and affirm. We need to be careful that that amount of verbal reaction from the adult isn't inadvertently reinforcing the display of the agitation. We should always be mindful of that. But you want to make this as fluent and as brief as possible to diminish the chances that it might be inadvertently reinforcing. We can think of this 5-step procedure as a self-regulatory implementation intention strategy, a so-called neutralizing routine. And what are we neutralizing here? Implicit bias that's going to drive the student to engage in the same old troubling behavior. So what are the implications of this for PBIS? If we go back to this slide, that repair and reclaiming work, there has to be space in a school that can comfortably, appropriately, therapeutically, and professionally allow for these peak accelerations, what some people would call crises or going off or whatever you want to call it, that the school has to understand that some small percentage of their students are going to engage in these behaviors. And if schools are truly going to be a reclaiming context for all children, and if all children are indeed going to get the behavioral support they need, the school needs the capacity to weather these episodes in an appropriately therapeutic, supportive, and productive way. And so, to do that repair and reclaim work, that can take a half hour to an hour to process what happened. That's a one-on-one event. What was going on in the classroom? What happened to make you upset? What were you thinking at that moment? What were you feeling at that moment? Right, you were feeling like you deserved to get it, right? To make all those private variables, those covert processes that we call private variables overt, it takes time. So you need to have people to do that work. We can't just get a kid calm and send them back. We need to do the work that informs the prevention efforts the next time we find ourselves at the trigger stage, right? That's what makes a kid emotionally and behavioral disordered, the fact that he goes through this escalation process with some regularity and some level of intensity, right? So if he does it on Monday, you can do the repair work, and that repair work informs your supports that you provide when he does it again on Wednesday. So when we think about PBIS, we need the practices to be able to do this. I don't care if it's LSCI. I don't care if it's trauma-informed care. I don't care if it's restorative practices. There needs to be substantive efforts to mitigate the effects of trauma in a way that is reclaiming and leads to improved health and improved decision-making. And that, again, involves a setting that can weather in a therapeutic and appropriate way and accepts that it's inevitable that some small percentage of the children are going to need this level of behavioral support. So we need the practices in place. We need the systems in place to support that. And then, of course, we would need to measure is engaging in this interpersonal work with the student that I'm calling what did I call it, repair and reclaiming work that is inevitably an interaction between the parties or among the parties in order to restore that relationship. This repair and reclaiming work here, by the way, is us doing a disproportional amount of the work to make the relationship work out. Most people would just bail. This is too much effort. I'm not hanging in there with this relationship. If getting to success with this individual requires that I do this heavy a lift, I'm out of here. I mean, anywhere else in life, that's where we would say, that's even what many adults say in schools. And we're saying, no, I'm going to persist on a very thin schedule. As an adult, I'm going to persist on a very thin schedule of reinforcement with this kid. My nurturing behavior is going to persist, even when this child punishes my nurturing behavior, right? Informally, we call that doing a disproportional amount of the work to make the relationship work out, right? People say relationships take work. Well, this is the work. This is the work, and then showing up here at the moment is the work. So most troubled students want to tell their story but lack the necessary skills and trust. They have this self-fulfilling prophecy that positive relationships with the adults are not possible. Rather than wait passively for that to occur, they turn passive into active and introduce toxicity into the relationship via their behavior. Untrained adults accept these expert invitations to conflict because they lack the necessary insight and skill to prevent this pattern from occurring. Teachers and schools need the tools and capacity to sustain positive relationships, by the way, that are constructed on the student's acquisition of new replacement behaviors. And sustaining positive teacher-child relationships is critical to reclaiming students with EBD who are on a predictable trajectory to myriad troubling outcomes. And simply put, if we don't repair, we repeat. And so that process afterwards, where we do the repair work for the relationship. And again, I would encourage you, I know every one of you, if you agree that the intimate relationships that you're committed to indeed take work, I know that repair work is what those repair efforts is what that work is, where you reassure each other, where you recommit to each other, where you acknowledge the legitimacy of the other's perspective, when you become able to predict their emotional reactions to things, when you understand them because you know them so well and care about them so much. You understand the idiosyncratic ways the person you care about perceives, feels, and things. You can anticipate that. And you can support them when you see those patterns unfolding. And you self-regulate yourself in the moment so as to break those interaction patterns. Right? That's what commitment to the relationship is. And my colleagues tell me not to call it love, that I'll get run out of the profession if I refer to it as love. But I think it's a very loving thing to do. And so that I won't get run out of the profession, I'll refer to it as compassion. Right? But who's going to step up and do that disproportionate work? Who's going to come in here and give these kids the legitimate dose of therapeutic support they require? Either we're going to do it or we're not going to do it. And if we don't do it, then the troubling, predictable outcomes, the statistically predictable outcomes are going to occur if we don't leverage change by truly investing in these processes. I'm done.
So good. So good. So helpful to hear that, Kevin. It was articulated so well. What I'm going to do is I'll stop the recording. So thank you again.